second presentation, which is by Savannah Jensen. It's entitled Haunted Lovers and Early Modern Ballads. Savannah, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Rachel. All right. So the Ballad of the Lamented Lovers begins with the death of a romantic relationship and ends in the death of both lovers. In between, the rejecting lover is haunted figuratively and literally by her former lover who has died of heartbreak. The rejecting lover laments her decision to break off the relationship, and ultimately the guilt she feels for doing so kills her. While melodramatic and sensational, The Lamented Lovers is not an anomaly. Among the ballads that feature ghosts in the University of California, Santa Barbara's English Broadside Ballad Archive, 28 of the 39 ballads featuring ghosts, or 72% of those ballads, share important similarities to the lamented lovers. I consider these ballads to make up a tale type, a term that I borrow from folklore studies and I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. And I call that tale type haunted lovers ballads. I define haunted lovers ballads by their plot structure. Because many characters in the ballads are unnamed, in this presentation I will use false lover to refer to characters in the ballads who have broken off the relationship central to the ballads. When I use the term true lover, I'm referencing characters in haunted lovers ballads who have been rejected by the false lovers. The standard plot structure looks like this. At the beginning of these ballads, the couple seems to be in a stable relationship. The pair have often already exchanged tokens or assurance of love, such as gold coins or rings, yet despite outward signs that the couple is about to be married, shortly into the ballad, one of the lovers, of either gender, rejects the other. The false lover often, but not always, breaks off the relationship in favor of a new and wealthier match. When the true lover is rejected, he or she dies soon after. The true lover's death is most commonly caused by love sickness, about 48%, but suicide, 27%, is another common cause. Upon hearing the news of the true lover's death, the false lover is often instantly overcome with grief, and often the false lover claims responsibility for the true lover's death. The death of the true lover is only the beginning of these ballads. Soon the false lovers are haunted by the true lover's ghost, who cause the false lover to feel a profound sense of grief or horror. By the end of the ballad, most false lovers join their partners in death, either by dying of some natural cause or dying by suicide. Those that survive until the end of the ballad are left in an isolating despair, wishing for their death. In this presentation, I'm going to explore how haunted lovers ballads define false lovers as murderers, the true lovers as victims, and explore what a just end means for these heartbroken couples. Haunted lovers ballads frame false lovers' rejection as murder of the true lover, no matter the true lover's actual cause of death. For example, in the ballad The Despairing Lover, the true lover complains to his false lover that, "You blast me with the breath, the wounds you gave me will fatal prove, each frown pronouncing death." The false lover's slightest gesture proves fatal to the true lover. Even the gestures that require little to no effort on her part, such as a breath or a frown, are mortally wounding. In contrast, the true lover is powerless, unable to retaliate in any meaningful way. The true lover imagines the false lover's hate as literally killing him, and this true lover might not be far off. The rejection has both emotional consequences and physical humoral consequences for the true lovers. True lovers are often violently afflicted by love sickness. The modern usage of love sickness has lost much of its original medical quality. The term has become synonymous with shallow romantic relationships or disappointments in love. However, in the early modern context, love sickness was considered, as Carol Thomas Neely points out, a powerful, quote, somatic disease of inflamed and congested genitals, characterized by uncontrollable erotic desire for the unconventional or unobtainable objects. Also known as erotic melancholy, this disease was thought to heat up the melancholic humors inside the bodies of the sufferers and affect the liver, heart, and brain. The only cures for this disease were sexual intercourse or the reciprocation of affections from the afflicted person's beloved. In haunted lovers' ballads, love sickness turns deadly without a cure. In the ballad The Lamented Lovers, the true lover cries to his false lover, "Oh, let thy frowns to blessings turn, for if in love I longer burn, 'twill prove my overthrow." What might first strike audience as a metaphor quickly reveals its true deadly nature, as the true lover's scorching love did straightway turn into a fever which did burn. He straight to bed did go, from whence he never did arise, but often said with sighs and cries, "Love proves my overthrow." The true lover in this ballad not only suffers from love sickness and overheated melancholy, but he dies from it. This kind of heated sensory imagery permeates haunted lovers' ballads. The sensory imagery should not just be read as a metaphor for the true lover's feelings. Instead, the passages should be read as symptomatic of an embodied experience. The false lover's rejection literally kills the true lover. Following the deaths of the true lovers, the false lover begins to see themselves as responsible for the true lover's death and see their own suffering as deserved quasi-legal punishment. In an answer to Sophontion's farewell, the false lover states, "For that cruel neglect of my duty, these pains I bear as legal reward." In another ballad, the false lover claims, "I that betrayed her into the arms of death, where she expires. Now I must resign my breath, it is required." In another, the false lover cries, "What have I done? My vows come fresh to mind, no peace of conscience can I find. Alas, there's nothing left for me but the reward of perjury." But maybe the most profound example of a false lover taking responsibility for the true lover's death can be found in the second half of The Lamented Lovers, where the false lover ends each stanza with the admittance of guilt. "My frowns have murdered thee. 'Twas I that murdered thee. My frowns had murdered thee. My love, I come to thee. My love, I come to thee." Even though this true lover has died of love sickness, the false lover claims that she has murdered him. The false lover believes they have killed their true lovers, and to be haunted and suffer for that betrayal is only fair. The guilt that the false lover feels when the true lovers die of love sickness can equally be applied when the true lovers die by suicide, the second leading cause of true lovers' death. And while suicide may seem to be a choice that the true lover makes, haunted lovers' ballads hold the false lovers accountable for the true lover's death by suicide. Take, for instance, The Pining Maid. The false lover describes how after she ends her relationship with her true lover, "That very night he drowned himself, all for love of me." She claims that his death was for her sake and for no other reason. She goes on to bluntly state, "I was the causer of his death." In the haunted lovers' ballads, the false lovers identify themselves as the true lover's cause of death at best and identify themselves as murderers at worst. To atone for their crimes, the false lovers believe that they must suffer and, if possible, reunite with their true lover. To assume that the reunions are designed to be happy would be a mistake. In fact, they are rarely happy at all. These reunions happen not because they make for happy endings. They happen because the reunion is the only just ending. Take, for example, the reunion A Godly Warning for All Maidens. In this ballad, the false lover is haunted by her true love for Bateman, who will be reunited with her no matter what. The ballad states, "Young Bateman's pale and ghastly ghost appeared before her eyes and said, 'Oh, thou art she that I must have and will not be denied.'" Because the false lover had made a vow to marry him, Bateman sees it as his right that they should be together. The false lover's feelings on the subject do not matter to him. And the night the false lover is to be carried away, she tells her friends, "Here comes the spirit of my love with pale and ghastly face, who till he bear me hence away will not depart this place. Alive or dead I am his right, and he will surely have, in spite of me and all the world, what I by promise gave." Like many false lovers, this false lover sees the justice in her reunion with her true lover. She too justifies her fate as his right because of her promise to marry him. Despite it being just, it is not a desirable fate for her. Instead, she recognizes it as something inevitable, claiming that Bateman will come into possession of her no matter what, if she or all the world objects to that fate. The reunion in which she is spirited away acts like a death and is what rights the injustice of her rejection that led to Bateman's death. The false lover has killed Bateman, so she too must experience death, at least metaphorically. While A Godly Warning for All Maidens provides an example of a lover who does not want to be reunited with her true lover, it is much more common for false lovers to desire that reunion. Some haunted lovers' ballads are set up so that the lovers tragically cannot reunite. These endings emphasize false lovers' feelings of grief and guilt. In an answer to the lady's tragedy, the false lover cannot escape his conscience. He claims, "Let me go where I will, yet I am daunted still. For why, I fancy still that I am haunted for my disloyalty." The false lover's inability to escape his feelings of guilt lead to the sentiments found in the ballad's final stanzas. "None but sad grief and care am I possessing. Kind death, thy dart prepare. Life is no blessing. Since I no comfort have, let me expire, that in the silent grave I may lie by her." The true lover's death has taken away all the joy of living for the false lover. He lives in a state of living death, unable to meaningfully live his life. Only death presents him with the opportunity to reunite with her and end his suffering. The false lover's living death acts as a punishment for his rejection of the true lover, and his punishment can only be ended with his literal death. Other haunted lovers' ballads depict exchange of a death for a death more clearly, as in the ending of the first tale found in the Oxfordshire tragedy. After coming to terms with his guilt over the death of his true lover, the false lover decides that he must die to be reunited with her. He states, "My dearest love and only joy, my wretched life must ended be. Now must I die and come to thee. His rapier from his side he drew and pierced his body through and through. He dropped down in purple gore where she did some time before. He buried was within the grave of his true love, and thus you have a sad account of his hard fate. The false lover's death parallels his true lover's in location of his death and the location of his burial. These parallels seem to invite the audience to imagine that the souls of both lovers will be reunited in the same place, just as their deaths have occurred in the same space. Even if audiences choose not to imagine what the afterlife looks like for these lovers, they're at the very least symbolically reunited through death, when their bodies are buried together. Dane Rosenbaum argues that Western culture has defined justice in terms of proportion, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In these ballads, false lovers can repent the pain that they have caused their true lovers through suffering and death that parallels what the true lovers have experienced. Both true and false lovers share the same fate, each instigated by the other. But is there another way to read these ballads? Colin Dickey has written, perhaps it's true that ghost stories arise from an injustice unavenged. But perhaps it's also true that part of what keeps these injustices alive in our consciousness is the titillating possibility that they were not entirely unjust. The simplification of the false and true lover ignores any possibility of complex motives on the part of the false lovers, and it seems if nothing else, these ballads primarily act like balms to soothe broken hearts, whether that soothing is just or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Savannah. That was fascinating. I'm storing up questions for Q&A, but thank you so much for sharing that with us. We will move on to our third paper for this morning, which is going to be presented to us by Madison Storrs from North Carolina State University. She has a paper on Donne and Herrick and the Aubade genre. Madison, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Rachel. And again, thank you to all the organizers. This is my first conference, so this will be memorable in many ways. So thank you. Come dawn, the poet is placed in an auspicious moment. As the morning sun rises, the poet and the beloved prepare for an imminent parting. Thus, the poet laments or welcomes the new day and perhaps a new love. The Aubade, which is a musical announcement of dawn, a sunrise song or open-air concert, has been a consistent poetic genre deriving from France during the 17th century. The genre was adapted for love poetry and ultimately became a poem about lovers parting at dawn. Although the genre was nascent in English circles at the beginning of the century, there were English poets already reworking the genre. I want to analyze two poems that claim the Aubade in their distinctive styles. John Donne and Robert Herrick, particularly Donne's The Sun Rising and Herrick's Corinna's Going a-Maying. While Herrick is often associated with the Cavalier poets in the tribe of Ben, his poems can exhibit the care to wit that largely defined the metaphysical poets, including Donne. During the 17th century, wit was a prominent exercise within the poetry of the period, as wit was a natural part of most 17th century poets' patterns of creativity and habits of thought. Thus, wit was a part of the cultural discourse, and poems such as The Vine and His Farewell to Sack are illustrations of Herrick's ability to write witty verse, and Corinna's is no exception to Herrick's talent. Both Donne and Herrick use wit to update and rework the Aubade genre in an examination of temporality and materiality. While Donne utilizes metaphorical conceit to dismiss the boundaries of the material world and nature, Herrick creates a reversal of the genre to urge his lover to leave the bedchamber to worship nature and enjoy the budding spring in their fleeting youth. John Donne's poem, The Sun Rising, is critically accepted as an English demonstration of the Aubade genre. The poem begins with the sun pushing through the curtains of two lovers in bed. In true metaphysical form, Donne's speaker gruffly denounces the rising sun as the light intrudes on the couple in what becomes a hyperbolic lamentation of dawn. Though lovers may experience sadness at parting, the genre suggests a more jubilant celebration of the morning and the awakening of new love. While Donne's speaker celebrates his new love, critics such as Harold Bloom recognize the speaker's pointed, antagonistic attitude towards nature in the poem. Moreover, Christopher D'Addario analyzes Donne's undertaking of the genre as an exploration of the various forms desire can take, and fascination with affective modes to contemplate and counteract the spatial realities of everyday life. Daddario notices continuity amongst Donne's poetry in which Donne cannot imagine the intimate privacy of his lovers without also worrying over the constantly intruding outside world. Thus, not only is Donne's Sun Rising a narrative of the impediment of the natural world, but also the inconstancy and dishonesty of the metropolis. While Donne's Aubade is a lamentation of lovers parting and a metaphysical conjoining of the lovers' souls, the poem also offers a distinct denial of the material world. In contrast, Robert Herrick's Corinna's Going a-Maying is not often critically read as an Aubade poem. However, the categorization is still present amongst scholars. Roger B. Rowland, in his analysis of Herrick's Hesperides, refers to Corinna's as an original dramatic and specifically English conflation of the Aubade and the pastoral invitation to love. Philip K. Jason also briefly refers to the poem as an Aubade. The poem is cast in the conventional form of the Aubade, a dawn song of a lover to his beloved. Despite the dearth of critical discussion on the poem as an Aubade, there is textual evidence for the speaker being with his beloved inside the chamber. Get you, sweet slug a bed, and above an hour since, yet you not dressed, nay, not so much out of bed. The lines insinuate that the speaker is observing his beloved and is waiting for her to get out of bed. However, if spatial and temporal indicators are not enough to place the speaker in the chamber, the etymology of the word by the Oxford English Dictionary highlights a documented English definition of the Aubade from the period as a song sung under a chamber window in the morning. By acknowledging this definition of the Aubade genre as song below the chamber, Herrick's Corinnas may still be categorized as such. Indeed, the Aubade genre is predicated on the eventuality of the lovers separating. Both poets question this convention. Donne's speaker wants the lovers to stay in bed, and Herrick's speaker wants the couple to leave the chamber to enjoy nature. In Sun Rising, Donne's speaker argues, "Look and tomorrow late tell me whether both the Indias of spice and mine be where thou left'st them, or lie here with me. Ask for those kings whom thou saw'st yesterday, and thou shalt hear, all here in one bed lay." To the speaker, the beloved represents all the commodities and treasures of the world, making it unnecessary for them to part. By comparing his lover to precious metals and spices, Donne's speaker is celebrating his beloved's beauty and denying a reason to explore the outside world. Unlike Donne, Herrick's speaker sees a world of possibility outside of the bedchamber. The speaker is arguing for the lovers to leave the room, which is a reversal of the genre. The speaker wants to extend the day and celebrate the spring in communion with the beloved. He urges, "Rise and put on your foliage and be seen, to come forth like the springtime fresh and green." Therefore, Donne defies the separation imminent in the genre, while Herrick wants to expedite leaving the bedchamber to enjoy the blossoming spring together. Not only are the poets redefining the temporality of the genre, but they also challenge the limitations of time itself. Accordingly, what is most interesting in their reworking of the Aubade genre is their similar usage of the language of nature throughout the poems, specifically their interactions with the sun. Donne begins his poem by chiding the morning sun, "Busy old fool, unruly sun," and warns that he could eclipse and cloud them with a wink. In lines, Donne's speaker is challenging the sun and using wit to attack an object in nature, an object which is a signifier of the passage of time. At the beginning of the Aubade, to have more time with his lover, the speaker orders the sun to go away. He also haughtily boasts that he could diminish the sun's beams by closing his eyes. With his use of apostrophe, Donne upends the Aubade genre. On the one hand, the speaker is partaking in a morning song, while also dismantling the celebratory nature of the genre by confronting the sun. Herrick also considers the sun's movements as a natural indication of time passing. His speaker laments, "Our life is short and our days run as fast away as does the sun." Similar to Donne's speaker, Herrick wants to fight temporality. However, the speakers reckon with mortality. How the speakers reckon with mortality is quite different. Donne's speaker argues, "Love all alike no season knows nor clime, not hours, days, month. which are the rags of time. This illustrates the speaker's belief that their love extends the bounds of time and space. Therefore, their love is a means of escaping the temporal binds of the material world. On the other hand, instead of trying to dismiss the sun, Herrick embraces the blooming morn. The speaker wants to enjoy the natural abundance of the spring landscape and receive them while the light hangs on the dew locks of night. By focusing on the eventual evaporation of the morning dew, Herrick's speaker again stresses the fleeting nature of the spring scene. The poets both meditate on the passage of time using the sun as a natural indicator. As the Obad is a genre that is a sunrise song, it is unsurprising that the sun plays a significant role in both poems. Donne's speaker relegates the sun as a servant which he can order around in his bedchamber. The sun, since thy duties be to warm the world that's done in warming us, is an indication that Donne places the lovers at the center of the universe. The lovers transcend the boundaries of materiality. Conversely, Herrick's speaker acknowledges the limitations of his mortality, which translates into an embracement of the carpe diem motif. Herrick furthers his usage of natural philosophy to discuss the passage of time in the final stanza. He stresses, as fast away as does the sun, and as vapor or a drop of rain, once lost, can ne'er be found again. So when or you or I are made a fable, song, or fleeting shade, all love, all liking, all delight lies drowned with us in endless night. Then while time serves and we are but decaying, come, my Carina, come, let's go a-maying. The speaker compares the life cycle of humans to the cycle of water on Earth. When vapor rises or the storm passes, it is as if it never happened. Thus, when the lovers' time passes on Earth, their presence will also be lost. Furthermore, Herrick compares the material rain to the abstract concept of fable, songs, and shade. Songs and fables will live on in memory, but are not tangible objects. Though the lovers may be immortalized in song, they will not be able to experience the materiality of nature after their death. So before they decay and fulfill the final phase in the natural cycle of life and death, they must also enjoy the May festivities. Therefore, Donne and Herrick reworked the Obad genre to consider the passage of time through the languages of nature. To further their examination of time and materiality through the Obad genre, both poets employ their individual styles. Donne engages in a metaphysical conceit to dismiss the material reality of the outside world. Meanwhile, Herrick utilizes classical illusion and nature imagery to support his carpe diem sentiments. In the final stanza of the poem, Donne compares his beloved to all states and himself to all princes. The purpose of this line is to establish the beloved as the boundaries that demarcate the colonized world. The speaker also refers to himself as the governing entity of that body. The lovers are the true world, whereas princes do but play us. Compared to this, all honors mimic, all wealth alchemy. The previous lines further deconstruct the material world. Princes only pretend to rule over the governing body. Honor in the outside world is only an imitation of the lover's honor, and their wealth is only base metals transformed through alchemical processes. Therefore, the metropolis is only a shadow of the reality that exists within the bedchamber. Thus, as Donne's speaker is attempting to break down the material world to establish their love as the only real thing, Herrick's speaker is holding fast to the material world. The speaker assures the beloved that, and as sweet as Flora, take no care for jewels for your gown or hair. Fear not, the leaves will strew gems in abundance upon you. In these lines, the speaker alludes to Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers, which illustrates Herrick's cavalier inclination for classicism. The lines also indicate that the beloved will be adorned by the beauty of nature. Interestingly, Herrick and Donne both refer to treasures of the earth, jewels, gems, and spices and precious metals. Yet Herrick is comparing the mundane natural fixtures of spring, flowers and green leaves, to precious stones, while Donne is comparing his beloved to the items extracted from the ground. Therefore, Herrick's speaker embraces the beauty of the natural world because nature can adorn and elevate the beauty of his beloved, whereas Donne's speaker rejects the treasures of the natural world and supplants his beloved in its place. The poet's meditation on materiality exemplifies their examinations of time within the poems. Donne's speaker rejects the outside world, which emphasizes the timelessness of love, while Herrick's speaker's insistent on celebrating spring illustrates his coping with mortality. By the end of each poem, the poets distinctly establish their relationship to time and the material world. Donne ends the sun rising with one final demand of the sun. Shine here to us and thou art everywhere. This bed thy center is, these walls thy sphere. Donne uses a cosmological argument for the final 2 lines of the poem. The speaker argues that the chamber is the world, and thus by shining on the lovers, the sun will be shining everywhere. The material world is condensed to the place in which the lovers occupy and follows the same argument as the rest of the poem. The lovers are the only real thing in existence. Although Donne's speaker's final act is rejecting the community and materiality of the outside world, Herrick's speaker embraces the community and festivities surrounding the spring. The speaker urges, there's not a budding boy or girl this day, but is got up and gone to bring in May. Many a green gown has been given, many a kiss both odd and even, many a glance too has been sent from out the eye love's firmament. Herrick's speaker argues that the entire community is celebrating the spring and the lovers should too. Moreover, Herrick's use of anaphora from lines 51 to 53 emphasizes the many who are in communion with the natural world. It's also interesting that the language used in these lines is quite sensual. Outside women are getting grass stains on their gowns from rolling in the grass and lovers are kissing. In his adaptation of the Aubade, Herrick allows his lovers to continue their affections beyond the bedchamber. Unlike Donne's lovers, whose love transcends the outside world, Herrick's lovers are enhanced by the natural world. Throughout their poetry, Donne and Herrick examine and reflect on their relation to the world. In their adaptations of the Aubade genre, The Sun Rising and Corinna's Going a-Maying examine the passage of time and materiality from within the lovers' bedchambers. In The Sun Rising, Donne's speaker rejects the world and creates a new one with his beloved, which is an exaggeration of lovers fantasizing about their new life together in the Aubade genre. Conversely, Herrick's speaker embraces the natural world and urges his beloved to leave the bedchamber, which is a reversal of the genre. While both speakers want to experience intimacy with their beloved, they express their love in different ways. Donne's speaker asserts that his beloved's beauty encompasses all lands and exceeds the sun's beams, while Herrick's speaker believes that intimacy with his beloved will be enhanced by the blossoming spring. The Aubade genre rests on the assumption that the lovers will separate, but both Donne and Herrick amend this genre to allow their lovers to transcend beyond the cloistered walls of the bedchamber. In a period defined by wit, Donne and Herrick fittingly awaken a genre to new depths of love, nature, and communion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madison. That was lovely. And let me just say that was a fabulous first conference presentation. And we at SRC are so honored that you gave it here. So thank you so very, very much for that. All right, we have reached the point in this panel where we can open things up to questions. If anyone has one to get us started, feel free to jump in. Fran, I see you waving at us. Make sure to unmute yourself and go right ahead.
This is a question for Kara. I so enjoyed that paper. I'm just very curious. I was thinking about the outcome of those letters. Can you fill us in both on whether they got out of prison, but also on whether they wrote up loving poetry or plays that suggest they were actually filling their end of the bargain?
That is such an interesting question. Thank you. So the case for Kid, right? I think he did get out, I believe. Yeah, so he got out, but he died very shortly afterwards. And then for Johnson, of course, he has so many in his circle. I would have to do more research on that, but I love that question. For sure, Field did get out. And so, and I think I was trying to make an argument that that there, as the field is kind of continuing to develop, right? The playwrights, right, their stature, I think, is of course changing over the course of these many years. And then by the time we get to the sort of the end of the period, people like Edward Allen, who was an actor that Dekker was writing to, already in themselves are gaining some of this kind of stature that some of the other, patrons, they can now turn to Allen and ask for money, which they did a lot. So yeah, that's an interesting question on sort of what came out of it. I think I'm most interested in the ways in which these letters got copied. So especially Chapman's letters, Johnson letters, and we have, the wonderful sort of manuscript of VA 321 at the Folger Shakespeare Library that has many of these letters copied. And so I'm interested in, well, why did people copy them? And there's been some research done on, why did people do letter copying at all? But certainly in these cases, I think it's something about the style, something about the wit, and I think something about the literariness of these letters that made people continue to be interested in them, which is why they got copied and why we even have them, why they survived.
I do think that there is something at the larger pattern. I know that Johnson makes a very radical life turn around the time of the gunpowder plot, and we don't know why, but that might also be a way to think about it.
Great, thank you.
I've got a follow-up question for Kara, in that I've got a horse load of questions actually, but I'll just focus on one, and it's related to Franz actually in a way, and that's have you given any thought, and if you haven't, that's fine, but have you given any thought yet to the ways in which these prison experiences may be reflected in the plays? Prison scenes, incarcerations, arrests. I mean, of course, we know that Ben Jonson had the letter M branded inside his thumb for a previous offense, etc. So any thought on that yet? And I would suggest that in the future, that would be a fascinating way to go.
Yeah, I'm interested in following up that. Of course, you think about moments when, Denmark is a prison, like that takes on a kind of new meaning, I think. Yeah, I'm interested in the ways in which there might be examples of letters. So if anybody knows of any plays in which there are kind of prison letters like this, it would be interesting to sort of see. But yeah,
Richard II, obviously in prison, that's a fascinating analog. But again, Shakespeare managed to stay out of Chokey, as far as we know, unlike the rest of these guys.
Yeah, well, that's what I think really fascinated me is there really kind of a lot of these letters, thinking about sort of what survived from the period. This seems to have been a pattern, right? Which says something about the sort of status of playwrights. But also I think I'm interested in sort of what was the work that was done in prison, like to what extent. I mean, Dekker for 7 years is in prison, and he didn't, I think, have he must have been sort of doing some writing while he was there. And so what was that? What was the quality of kind of that? How would that influence if you're in this barbarous environment, right? But yeah, it's certainly something to follow up.
I know that this is very old-fashioned, but Frank Kermode in The Sense of an Ending has a chapter on writing in prison, and it's wonderful.
Oh, wow. I will check that out.
I think I saw Robert waving at us before. Did you have a question? Make sure to unmute yourself.
Yes. Those are wonderful questions already raised. I don't have one that good. Mine is very simple. Are there writings on your topic already competing with the new blockbuster that you have coming?
Is that addressed to one panelist in particular or to all?
Oh, I'm sorry. The same for Kara.
For Kara. Okay, great, thanks.
I wondered whether writing about prison, not just prison letters, but the kind of follow-up questions that have just been raised. Has someone published a book already that really follows the whole thing in the context of what happened to those imprisoned poets?
I don't think so. Not that I found. So if somebody knows about that, I mean, certainly there are many biographies, right? And so I guess I'm interested in the, of course, each one of these letters, right, has to be contextualized. But like my fellow panelists, I'm really interested in, to what extent was there kind of an existing genre for prison letters? And I need to do a lot more work on what were the other manuals, because there's so many other examples of, collections of kind of these fictional model letters for particular contexts. But I'm interested in what ways we can see a sort of poetic adaptation of this, which is again, sort of why this was such a great panel that brought together these three papers with such wonderful overlapping ideas about how do we see the kind of challenging of genre? How do we see adaptation in the Aubade or the ballad? And so I think that's sort of where I'm going to be going with that. But certainly I think thinking about, well, what were those outcomes for these individuals? But I don't think anybody has altogether sort of done something about the imprisoning of all of these writers. I mean, I think there's some focus studies, but I'm not sure there's anything that's collective. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Faith, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm so sorry because mine is also for Kara. But I'm also sorry because my audio was cutting in and out a little bit. So if you answered this in one of the bits that it cut out, you could just tell me that you answered it and I'll chat with you previously or later because I don't want to bother anybody else. I was really fascinated when you started talking about the manuscript collection of these letters all at once. And I know there are a lot of printed templates for letters in the same era. So is there any print evidence that people have, like, here is a sample get out of jail letter, or are there ways in which these letters follow the established model of some of the more subservient or obedient or pleading letters that are already present in those template documents, or are they inventing a completely new genre on their own?
I'm arguing, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm arguing that there are, the one I'm sort of starting with is the 1613 example, but there are other examples of letter models of, for almost every occasion, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you might need, how to get how to ask for a position or letter of recommendation. So there's certainly the example I gave was that 1613 sort of, I'm in jail and I need help, so I'm working with sort of that as perhaps, one potential model. And so I was sort of following the particular types of appeals. Of course, letters have all kinds of conventions just more broadly since everybody's writing, letters in the early modern period who is literate. But I think what I would answer to that is that there's certainly following some of the kind of overall things, the appeals for friendship, right? The appeal to morality. Oh, you're such a good person. I know you would, do whatever you could. But I think they're also a little bit, there's a couple differences, which is that idea that they're really protesting innocence very explicitly in a pretty heavy-handed way, which kind of surprised me because we don't really see that in the model. And then there's this kind of attention to work and labor. And I think it's a real sticky issue for people in the theater because of the stereotypes about theatrical professionals. And so that's something that that I want to sort of continue to see is how are playwrights, actors, how are they defining themselves in their letters when they have a chance at kind of textual self-presentation? How are they presenting themselves, especially in these really sticky rhetorical situations?
Thank you.
Heather.
Well, thanks to all the panelists. I have a question for Savannah, and I love this paper. I've done work on repentance and satisfaction of for guilt, and I wish I knew about this genre because it just sounds utterly fascinating and just really at the heart of what I should have known. So I have a couple of really basic questions and then a more conceptual question. Were when you called it the haunted lover, were these ever married couples, or is all of the falsity and betrayal between pre-married couples?
In this tale type, I'm looking at characters who are not yet married.
Not yet
Because
married.
what I've noticed, it's a really interesting liminal space where there seems to be a lot more threatening. But once you get to married couples with ghosts, at least, what I've noticed, it's always the wife being murdered by her husband and coming back to haunt him as he's awaiting.
Usually because of adultery, like would that be the reason for the murder, or?
So for the wives being murdered, it depends. There's a little bit more variation. Off the top of my head, I remember just a woman chastising her husband, or saying you can't be drunk all the time. Acts of rage. But there's a little bit more variation.
Okay, all right. Well, that's really that's interesting in and of itself. So there's the lovers, and then there's the actual married couples, and that they're coming back for different things. And then I guess I wanted to know if the return of these ghosts was sort of considered quote unquote real, or this was a more imaginative or allegorical way of dealing with the survivor's guilt.
I think that depends on who your audience member was, because this is such a time where, although the government and the church says there's no such thing as ghosts because we're a Protestant nation, people would have recognized, oh, I've heard these Catholic traditions. You have a lot of writers like Ludwig Lavater over in Germany, who gets translated in English, who I'm pretty sure is writing to a Protestant audience who's saying, sure, there might be something like ghosts, but it's probably not a ghost. It's probably like an evil spirit.
Yeah.
And so I think for some audiences, and for just because of the simplistic nature of the story, I read them as quote unquote real ghosts. But I think you would have had just as many audience members maybe thinking along the terms that you do, that maybe this is just a way of clearly establishing someone's guilt without it actually being a ghost. It's kind of like an allegory or a tale that you're to learn from, even if parts of it are fictional.
Okay. And there's never a sense that the ghost is a figment of the false lover's imagination.
So it's mostly, when we look at these tales, occasionally you get a third person involved. But I think the ballads in particular read as something that's real. There's not a lot to imply it could be fictional. And I think that's just like the simplistic nature of the way the ballad goes, where I think in different representation medias like drama, you have more options to say, ooh, was it a ghost? Is it not a ghost?
All right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I'm really interested in reading some of these now.
Thank you.
Let's see. I think I saw Scott's hand first, and then we'll go over to Chris after that.
Thanks. I'll just follow up with Heather's question to Savannah. And obviously, working on the Mirror for Magistrates, I thought a lot about ghosts, and there is that medieval tradition that just people kept on accepting. They didn't ask how the ghosts get there. They just know they did because everyone said it for centuries, so they must actually exist. It's interesting, though, if you, in the Protestant context, John Calvin when asked, well, where do people go after they die? Do they go to heaven? Do they go to hell? Or do they have soul sleep where they stay in their grave until the day of resurrection and then are awakened by Christ and judged? Or what is that Old Testament bit about going to sleep with Abraham and, going to the bosom of Abraham and sleeping there? And Calvin finally said, probably thinking about how prevalent ideas of ghosts were as well in the institutes, he said, God hasn't made it clear to us, so we should not ask ourselves where people go immediately after they die, but just take faith that God knows what he's doing and kind of leave it from there. And I think that opens up for Protestants, if they are trying to reconcile doctrine with the traditional belief in ghosts, the ability to say ghosts can't exist without having to go back to Catholic claims.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about that before. That's really interesting. I'll have to go back and look at that. Because I think I'm still getting on looking at all these different treaties with authors saying, oh, is it real? Is it not real? And I do think Ludwig Lavater, who I've looked at a little bit more, who's a German author, he really does open this door and he says, okay, let's look at the claims. And so his conclusion finally is it's probably a demon in disguise. But I do think he's definitely writing to Protestants who are on the fence, who are saying, ooh, I see where some people are coming from, but here are all these experiences and stories and cultural knowledge we have about ghosts. I can't just stop using it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really interesting. I'll have to take more of a look into that.
The historian Peter Marshall has a nice book on death and the afterlife as well, where he talks about some of these same issues.
Awesome. Thank you. I will take a look into that.
If I could give a question both to Savannah, related questions both to Savannah and to Madison, sort of following up. One for Savannah having to do with comparisons that you would make between these poems of haunted lovers and one of my very favorite John Donne lyrics, The Apparition, in which there's a very malevolent person imagining himself as dead in the future and coming to haunt his lover. If you could speak to that, and then just Madison, if you could compare The Sun Rising in the terms you discuss it in comparison to Corinna with The Good Morrow, which is of course another Donne poem about the morning. But Savannah, The Apparition, thoughts on that or not, if you don't?
Oh, I've thought about this one a lot, actually. Yeah, Donne seems to be writing in a similar kind of genre, and I think it's really interesting. There are some things I have to work out because a lot of the ballads I'm looking at are from the late 1600s. Donne's obviously writing maybe 50 years, if not more, earlier. But then we do have a play written about the same time as Donne called the Fair Vowbreaker, or the Vowbreaker, or the Fair Maid of Clifton, which is definitely adapted from one of the ballads that we only have copies of later. And so chronologically, I'm trying to figure it out. But I do think that based on the evidence, based on these very similar stories are told across a century, I think they've got to be pervasive. So, and that might not even be what we have in the written record. That might also just be, going back to the folklore, it might just be stories that people told each other. And so that we wouldn't have written records of. So there's a lot that I'm curious about that I want to put in a chronology on paper, but I also want to recognize there's probably a lot that we won't have written records of. And I'm still
let me suggest that one difference, although many similarities between The Apparition and these poems you've read, is that Donne's poem is very funny.
Yeah.
Extorting laughter, ironical laughter out of this really grim context is intriguing.
And as a variation that I didn't get to in this paper, there are several ballads that do tell it from in the future tense, usually from a male's point of view, saying, I am going to haunt you if you do not reciprocate my affections. And that lines up so well with Donne. Although we have one example of a woman doing it as well. And so I think there's a lot, I think it's out there. I think it's, Donne is definitely doing a condensed version that does come off as probably more malevolent than what I'm seeing in the ballads. When I've compared them with students, my students have said the ballads are much more sappy, where Donne's is a lot more aggressive.
Acidic. Madison, comparisons maybe with The Good Morrow.
Yeah, I think that's, thank you. I think that's an interesting comparison too, because again, I think Donne's kind of attacking like the material world. He's, kind of listing all of these wonders in the world and all the things that there is to see. And he kind of goes back to this idea of everything in the world can be condensed in this one room. And I think it's fascinating. I was looking at some research about the growth of the city in London during this time, and it was doubling in size, and so there weren't very many moments of intimate alone time. And so perhaps maybe he is trying to find moments of respite and intimacy by kind of rejecting all of that and kind of focusing on the lovers in that one room. Oh, sorry, I think your mic is muted.
Okay. And
Thank you very much. I was just saying thank you.
can I follow up on Chris? Because I really like the linking of the papers from all three of the papers. And one of my questions was for Madison. Chris asked Rachel about, Chris asked about connections between and was talking with Savannah. And I want to ask you about the connection between the Abad tradition and poetry and what happens when it's embodied on stage, to go back actually to Heather's paper yesterday. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Romeo and Juliet Morning After.
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't have as much experience with knowing about the Obad on the stage, but yeah, I do think it's kind of fascinating seeing then this intimate moment, and you have this scene with Romeo underneath the bedchamber, so you have this literalization of the Obad. So that's an interesting way to look at it.
Right. Well, and him going out into the world.
Yeah.
Remains behind. So yeah.
Robert, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, for Savannah, I was fascinated with your compartmentalizing and just a wonderful anatomy of a lot of ballads. And I was reminded of a good friend who, after a troublesome divorce, comforted herself with listening to country western ballads. My baby done left me again. And I just wondered if about the possibilities, this is sort of a lowbrow question, I guess, of a work that would anatomize the early modern ballads in comparison to modern ballads of that sort.
So I actually teach a first year writing class, and I've taught it where it's themed around ghost stories, and I've had my students do this, this exact same thing. And so they compared it to Taylor Swift a lot. But yeah, I think there's something about having your heart broken and needing to express it, or needing to feel someone else has had that same experience. And I think that probably helps with some of the fact that we have so many of these ballads left. I mean, we don't have a lot of ballads to begin with. So I'm thinking the fact that we have 39 that are kind of in the same genre says a lot, not just about like how many were produced, but also like how people were saving them over time. So there does seem to be this, from this late 1600s to now, this kind of enjoyment of this self-pity and the thought of the possibility of revenging on the person who has broken your heart.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a burning question? Oh, Heather, did I see you waving at us?
Well, this was just going to sort of follow up what Savannah just said, and which makes it increasingly clear to me that these ballads are both, bring together both an urge for revenge and an urge for repentance at the same time, and that those things are so deeply implicated. Usually I think of it within the same person, but actually here it's on either side of the love duo. I was just going to ask Kara about to go back to the prison letters and letters by prison letters from playwrights, which I just think is such a wonderful focus on trying to think about how dramatic authorship develops and sort of trace that. So it's quite fascinating. I was wondering if you had you had thought about the ending of Eastward Ho, where the characters are released from prison and sort of give a kind of a poetic ending to their experience. And in some ways, this follows on Chris's question about how does the prison experience get expressed in the plays. So it's an ending that's always interested me, and I was just wondering if that was one of the ones you might have considered, since Eastward Ho, it's sort of prescient since he's put in prison because of it.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at that, and so I'm glad that you kind of called my attention to it again. I'd be interested. I don't remember the tone of the end, because I think one of the things that this conversation is getting me to think a little bit more about from the questions to the panelists is, how the genre might be treated in terms of tone. We do know that there are some pamphlets that are sort of contemporary to the prison letters that are being written by the playwrights, and they're saying things like John Taylor, for example. He creates an anagram of the word prison, and he sort of says, to all good verses, prisons are great foes, which suggests that writing you can't write in prison. And many poets keep fast in prose, which is interesting. So are they turning to letters? Are they doing something else? And then there are other kind of more satirical comments about, about prisons and studies of prisons, but they list all of the different types of prisoners who you might find, including playwrights, pitiful poets who write their own tragedies. So I think certainly, the kind of layers and ways of thinking about how various contexts might have happened, on stage in different types of plays, tragedies, comedies, right? Histories. And so thinking about, where these letters might appear and how they might be, how people might have reacted to them. I think I'm going to find a kind of a range, right? That there's lots of different perspectives. Yeah. But I can't remember. I'm racking my brain to remember how that.
Well, it has this kind of ironic. It's ironic, and you can't really tell whether the characters are truly penitent for what they claim to be penitent for as they're leaving prison. But then that reading gets really, just as you're saying, you have to reconsider it after you know that Johnson went to prison for the play. So that could even be fun too. Like, how does the post experience reconfigure a previous experience? Yeah, so that's great. Thank you.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'd like to encourage a dialogue between Kara and Jonathan Shelley, because obviously it would be, if Jonathan is having prisoners read Shakespearean plays, they might be extremely interested in the kind of letters that people wrote from prison at the time that Shakespeare was alive and working. Thoughts?
Yeah, I had a question.
There you go.
Kara, first, I want to say hi, because I just realized the second time we have crossed.
We've done this before, yeah.
Because we were on the short scripts panel or seminar at the Shakespeare Association of America. So it's wonderful to see you again. No, I mean, my one thought after seeing this is, I'm going to confess, I was not aware of sort of the rich biography of all of these early modern playwrights who had these prison letters and had these prison experiences. And I guess my initial reaction is this is like further proof about why Shakespeare's certain kind of monopoly on prison education is faulty to a certain extent. I don't know of any Johnson behind bars programs or like Kid behind bars program, but perhaps that's what they should be to a certain extent. Yeah, I have two questions. One is, one is very basic. One is just, is there any way from these letters to get a sense of the material conditions of prison that they perceived? I mean, you emphasized a lot on the kind of rhetorical things that it seems the prison experience kind of elicited. But I was curious if there's anything in what they say about the kind of day-to-day or just what they have. I've seen another presentation from an art historian who did some work about prisons, and she brought up the fact that apparently, although I do think it was class-based, you could bring a lot of stuff with you in prison. That in certain circumstances, you could almost like move in a, especially if you were royalty, you could like move an apartment in with you in prison to a certain extent. But I don't know, but I imagine there's probably a lot of variance around that. The second one I had, and this goes to, you made the point about how, you know, we see the stature of these playwrights rising very much. Did they perceive, I'm curious if you know, did they perceive themselves as privileged, or if not privileged, somehow exceptional in their standing while they were in prison? I think it was from Kidd, you read one section where he referred to being with Goths and Vandals. And that seemed to be an interesting way in which he sort of did not see himself as part of a kind of general prison population, that he saw himself as someone who was truly a playwright, who kind of had a mere temporary existence within criminality. But anyways, those are the things I'm definitely curious about. And I will just say that, like, I'm very much going to do a Kidd and Decker poem and Johnson poem in the future, if not these letters, just because, yeah, I think, again, like Shakespeare, despite being very prevalent in prison education, is a little misplaced for a lot of reasons, I think. Anyways.
Yeah, I've been sort of trying to follow, you know, and think about the ways in which this type of study, which somehow I just started thinking about around March 13th or so, you know, I suddenly was starting to think about prisons and writing in prison. Is it possible? But I think that maybe to kind of take the second question first, yeah, I think maybe some exceptionality, perhaps. I mean, certainly the kind of protests of innocence would maybe suggest that. But I think that a lot of the reason why so many of the playwrights were in prison has to do with debt, you know, and we see this with actors too, right? The kind of constant concerns about that. And you're right that there's quite a bit of porousness, right, between the outside world, and that's been sort of well documented by scholars looking at that. So it's hard to sort of say. I think it really depended on, you know, your prison, the prison that you were in. It depended on your situation, right? I think it's different if you're in the Tower. So were you arrested for treason? Were you arrested for debt? And what are the different kind of conditions? And there were several prisons, right? And they're pretty well documented and have kind of different characters or flavors. And I think also, could you bribe, right? And so some of these letters might be, you know, hoping not just for release, but maybe for money that would help them, you know, negotiate and buy better bread or something, or books, right, or something. The issue with some thinking about the materiality, because of course I would really love to know, you know, what is the what did that kind of paper look like? And there are some little examples of people sort of using, as early modern people did, sort of just sort of recycling, right, paper to you know, to write a letter, to write part of a letter. But the case with you know, Chapman and Johnson, we have copies, right? And so we don't really know maybe what that, you know, what those look like. But yeah, I think there isn't to answer your first question, there aren't a lot of descriptions of, you know, oh, there's a guy across from me who's in manacles, who's suffering in these ways or whatever. But I think they just sort of hint at it. And this might be, I'm very interested in the ways in which, you know, what happens when you take this kind of early modern practice like letter writing and you give it to people who are so well trained in sort of, you know, rhetoric and, you know, audience and thinking through those things. And it seems as though there is a real attention to decorum. I think as letter writers, playwrights, actors, they're pretty careful about, you know, thinking through the audience and gearing it towards particular audiences. So I'm not seeing there, and they're also very, very focused, Jonathan. They're like, okay, and, you know, I really need help or aid, or, you know, so I think they're extremely, they're full of flattery, more so than a lot of the other letters, you know, for example, of Johnson's that he might have written to his patrons or friends. They lay that on pretty thick, but they're also very aware of their situation, and I think they're trying to kind of remedy it. So I think I'm not really seeing, I would love to see more specificity about like, well, what kind of writing are they doing in prison? But instead we just have these examples of, the requests. And so I'm interested in, in what way are they presenting themselves as they're making those requests, and what can we learn about the profession and how they wanted to be seen or not seen as a result of that presentation.
If I can just respond real quickly, what I think is like really fascinating about this is that, let me put it this way. Today, requests from prisoners are looked on very suspiciously, I think, in my experience, in a lot of ways. Like, I get requests for like letters of recommendation to parole boards, and it's sometimes hazy about like whether or not I can write those or something like that, or if it's even proper for them to be making these kinds of requests. I haven't had it happen, but certainly things come in where people will request material stuff and everything. And I'm actually really fascinated by the ways in which, at least I think as you've described the kinds of requests and the sort of askings that we're encountering in these letters, I mean, these seem very kind of decorous and proper kinds of things. And it's interesting the way that, to a certain extent, I would say now these are seen or sometimes perceived as kind of grubby or sort of improper in these kinds of ways, that I think your research does a lot to help us sort of historicize or understand what these things are, and look at them in a different light. Anyways, but I'm fascinated, and we'll be in touch, I think.
Yeah, I think we definitely should talk further, because that's, I think that's that provides like, a whole different way of kind of thinking about, the history of the practice.
All right, folks, we are coming up on our last minute or so of this panel. So I'm going to abuse my chair privileges and just ask each of the panelists to say something real quick before we end. I'm just so fascinated by all of these genres that each of you are asking us to think about a little differently, or maybe to discover for the first time. So I'm just very curious to hear a little bit of each of your process. How did you discover these? And or if that's not an interesting story, where you hope to take it in the future. So maybe if each of you could just give us 15 seconds or so of how did you discover these fascinating genres and connections. Maybe we'll go in reverse order. We'll start with Madison, and then Savannah, and then Kara can finish this off.
Well, I was working on a lot of romantic poetry when I wrote this paper, and so the languages of nature really fascinated me. And so when I was looking at Herrick's and Dunn's perception of nature and how love is a new beginning, and kind of how they were dealing with that, I think it kind of interested me mostly in the language of nature, and kind of looking at how they're using this genre as kind of like a blossoming and birth of love, and how they were kind of using nature to kind of explore that, or reject, I guess, nature.
Thanks a lot, Madison. That's great. Savannah, how did you discover these crazy ballads?
I was taking a class on Shakespeare and ontology and agency, and we got to Richard III, and we were talking about all these different worldviews that the different characters had. And I was like, okay, there's going to be ghosts, people have died, so we're going to have some answers. And I did not have answers by the end about what the early modern worldview is after death. And so my professor, she showed me she was like, ask these questions and apply them more broadly. And so she showed me this University of California, Santa Barbara's early English broadside ballads archives, which is fabulous. And I was like, I'm going to dig in that and see if I have any answers. And I have more questions.
As it so often happens. All right, Kara, how did you discover these letters?
I'm most interested in sort of actors' letters and what they're saying about their profession, which might be different sometimes from what playwrights say. But whenever I would sort of talk with people about that, they would say, "But what about Dekker?" And I'd be like, "Well, he wasn't an actor." But his letters are wonderful. I mean, because of the sort of wit and style within them. So I'm excited to sort of see if I can go deeper into it. What I'd really like to do is I'm finding that people like Johnson are also interested in letters, they're copying like whole sections of letter manuals, you know, for example, in timber, we see that. And also, I think I've just found that Decker is perhaps writing some of these model letters himself that are getting printed. And so actors as letter writers, playwrights as letter writers, that's what's really interesting to me. So thank you so much for moderating the panel.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you all, panelists. If everyone wants to unmute yourselves and give them a quick round of applause so that they can hear us this time. Thank you so, so much, panelists. And thanks everyone for your patience. I let us run a couple minutes into break. So as far as I know, we are back at 10:45. Deneen, is there anything else we need to know?
No, that's it. You're lovely.
All right.
Should we log out of this channel and then come back in, or could we just mute ourselves?
You can do whichever you prefer. Either one is fine. If you just want to mute yourself and go away, come back, that's fine. But we'll let you back in if you do go out.